Welcome back to Hour 2 of Cavuto Coast to Coast. I'm David Asman, in for the great Neil Cavuto. President Trump condemning the groups behind the violence in Charlottesville just moments ago. Take a listen.
Racism is evil, and those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs, including the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups that are repugnant to everything we hold dear as Americans.
To former Army intelligence officer Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, former Democratic Missouri State Representative Don Calloway, Washington Examiner writer Emily Jasinski, and former Vice Chair of Diversity Outreach for Trump. We're happy that we could get her back, Brunel Donald Shea. Good to see you all. Thank you, Brunel, for coming in.
God bless you.
Thank you. God bless you as well. Colonel Shaffer.
Hey, David.
There's an interesting phenomena that we've seen before. Frankly, you see it throughout the history of the 20th century, where the far right and the far left kind of come together, and the distinctions between them blur, particularly as you see more clearly their displays of violence, no?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I think the violence which started, frankly, before the inauguration, Jim Woolsey, speaking of left and right, we were riding together right after the inauguration, ran into a street of Antifa where violence started there. And David, look, I just happened to be in Charlottesville over the weekend. I saw some of the beginning of this demonstration ramp up. People tend to forget that the Ku Klux Klan was created by the left. It was a Democrat outgrowth after the Civil War. The Nazi movement, Hitler's movement, was created as National Socialists, a social movement. So you're right. But the bottom line is this: it's all violence. And I think President Trump appropriately called out everyone regarding the fact that violence is not an acceptable method of expressing political speech, and this is something he said has got to stop.
Well, he said it. He said it today, Don. Are you satisfied with what he said?
Hey, David, it was a great statement. Unfortunately, it was 48 hours too late, but credit where it's due, it was a very good statement. The question that I have from my perspective is this statement reflective of the president's true moral convictions on this issue, or is it reflective of a political decision that he's made that it hurts him more politically to not say anything rather than to say something at this point? However, it's a good statement. However, I'm also concerned with the idea that a Steve Bannon, a Sam Clovis, a Stephen Miller, and a Sebastian Gorka, who have been white supremacist sympathizers, still sit in top leadership positions in the White House. Okay. So let's look forward from today, and I hope that the president's actions on this issue, as well as the DOJ and Attorney General Sessions, are reflective of his statement that he gave just a moment ago.
Brunel, you know some of those people who we just mentioned. I'm sure you would disagree with his characterization of them as sympathetic in any way to white supremacists. But to the extent that you know Donald Trump, and to the extent that you know the people who work with him, it's impossible to get into somebody's head and figure out what their true moral convictions are. But do you see any signs of racism or white supremacy in the White House?
You know, I've been pretty much outside, but for what I'm gathering, everybody in there is, looking out for the nation. And I'll respond to that 48 hours. The president made a blanket statement. He said he does not condone bigotry, hatred on any side, left or right. And as far as I'm concerned, all he did was break it down a little bit more by adding the KKK and adding these other people. But I would say this: he came out with the unity and passion and love that we needed to hear as a nation. And I guess even those who may have been a little apprehensive about his first statement, I believe he knocked it out the park, letting them know that he is the president of the United States of America, the red, white, and blue, and it doesn't matter what color you are. Racism is evil. And I'll say this too: if there is any extremism in our government, I believe that the right man is on the job, which is General Kelly, to root it out. So I have faith in my president and faith in the chief of staff on making sure that everything is copacetic.
Emily, to the extent that this country can move beyond race politics and the colorblind justice that Dr. Martin Luther King talked about, the Wall Street Journal has a lead editorial today called "The Poison of Identity Politics," and they say that wonderful colorblind justice about which the civil rights movement used to stand has turned into identity obsessiveness. And they say a politics fixated on indelible differences will inevitably lead to resentments that extremists exploit in ugly ways on both the right and the left. Is the real danger here that we've become so obsessive about racial identity that it gives room for these racist groups, either on the right or the left, to pop up?
Well, I definitely think that we're in a place in society where, whether it is the left or whether it is really far-right fringe elements, they are obsessed with dividing us on the basis of race. I think that's toxic. I think it's disgusting, and I think it does so much more to divide us than unite us. And I think that's why we have these movements that are popping up on the right. I think these far-right people, I hesitate to even call them right, they are reacting to, I think, a lot of what they're seeing from the left, which is, you know, on either side, it's sickening. There's no excuse for it, but we have to stop talking about these things so obsessively and recognize the commonness in our humanity.
One thing, though, Colonel Schaefer, I mean, we do have the First Amendment, and as repulsive and frankly would make me want to roll up my sleeves and punch somebody is that the sort of torch rally that you had in front of. Now, I don't want to incite any violence, and I don't want any tweets about people saying I do it, because I wouldn't. But when you see people spouting the kind of absolute hatred that you hear on both the left and the right, it does make you mad. I mean, is there any way? We used to have laws against protests that incite violence. I think we put that to bed. But is there going to be any measure of an attempt to kind of revive any of those laws?
Well, look, let's split this both ways. Sedition is against the law. You cannot demand, and this would have happened under President Obama, anyone cannot demand the violent overthrow of a legitimately elected government.
Well, you mentioned that in January 20th, I mean, we saw the kind of demonstrations that led to riots in the streets of Washington that were for exactly that, and yet I don't know if anybody was arrested for sedition.
Right, but we have to look. I welcome the idea of free speech, but you know, what I resent is the mainstream media trying to paint the conservatives to be part of this alt-right. It's not true. I resent that for the left as well. But we have to focus on what's best for the country. Violence is not adequate ever.
Don, what do you think?
You know, I'm somewhat bewildered that we're having this conversation. It's been part of the conversation for the last week that there's some type of moral equivalency between protesters, anti-racist protesters on the left, and what's happening on the right. Let's be very clear. There is no moral equivalency to the Ku Klux Klan and to Nazis. They're perhaps equal only in this world.
Hold on a second. You should go to Venezuela. You'll see a little equivalency.
Please let me finish. They're only approached perhaps by ISIS. Yet the president couldn't find it in his heart until today to condemn ISIS. To condemn Nazis. There's no moral equivalency between Black Lives Matter, between anti-racist protesters that we're seeing on the left, and what we saw in the streets of Charlottesville when the Klan and Nazis, let's not call them the right, my panelist colleague is correct.
These are not Nazis. I call them Nazis, but the point is, Brunel, that any group.
These are Nazis.
Okay.
These are not Republicans. These are not people on the right.
Let me give Brunel a chance to come in, if you don't mind.
Thank you.
Because Brunel, the fact is that anybody who takes up a stick and thinks that a stick works better or should be used in public discourse as an excuse for some kind of freedom of speech, anybody, whether they're on the right or the left, is just as abhorrent in my eyes.
Absolutely. Any kind of extremism. And there's this other thing that nobody's bringing up. All of those journalists that were, that urine was poured all over them by those on the left, no one's talking about that. But what I will say is the president has put his mouth now on this situation. And he is saying, I'm not a part of any extremist group. The only group I'm a part of is the American people group. The president needs to know that we, the American people, are behind him 100% when he, of course, steps up to this level and says, hey, enough is enough. We are behind him. We love America, and we're not going to let these small, minuscule, petty groups separate us and divide us any longer.
But
God
Emily,
forbid,
it's more than the groups, and this thing inevitably gets pulled into the political sphere. You could sense it coming even as we were watching the riots unfold on our television screens. You knew this was going to be sort of dragged into the political arena. No matter what the president had said or when he said it, would he not have been condemned in some way for some association for what happened in Charlottesville?
He would have. And look, I'm in the camp that I think he should have that death was caused by the white nationalists. He should have said that at the moment. But there's already a preconceived notion among so many people on the left that he is racist. You know, there's nothing he can do to convince them that he's not. So this was going to be political no matter what. It's silly for us to pretend that there aren't elements on both sides of the spectrum that are violent. I don't hear any conservatives comparing peaceful liberal protesters to the violent. I don't see the moral equivalence being drawn between peaceful people and violent people. I think that's completely unfair. We're comparing people, the violent left with the violent right, and both need to be condemned, and there's nothing wrong with saying so.
And they are
Absolutely.
a marginalized,
That's right.
very small minority in this country.
Petty, minuscule.
As
piece
we
of our
have proved
country.
here, because we often disagree, but we get along just fine. Colonel Schaefer, thank you very much.
thank you.
Don, Emily, and Brunel, we appreciate you being here.
God
Thank
bless you, and God bless
Thank
America.
you.
Thanks for having
I think
us.
we all agree on that. And